Today we're going to be covering expressions, particularly the linear expression, particle systems, and a bunch more in Adobe After Effects. I'm using the latest version. This is the 2020 version. This is the beta version. And because of that, this tutorial is going to be slightly newer and more up to date than previous tutorials where you might have needed to do slightly more cumbersome expressions, but I'm going to cover that too and hopefully break it down in a really slow and methodical way. This is designed for beginners, so it's going to go at a slow pace. Once you have After Effects open, you're going to click on New Composition, and for your purposes, you can do whatever you want. You're just going to have to change some numbers if you do it slightly differently than me, but we're going to do HD, and we're just going to title it Particle Test 1, because I am going to show you a slightly different way, in a slightly more cumbersome way, but it will explain the expressions in greater detail when we do our second test. And in this one, we're going to keep everything basically the same. Go ahead and click OK. Again, we're in HD, 29.97 frames per second. Doesn't really matter. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and go do a new solid. New solid. If you are on a Mac, you can hit Command Y. We're going to go ahead and just make this a dark blue. Click OK. And here we have our background. Just for a little bit of extra effect, we're going to go over here to our effects and presets and search for star. And we're going to pick Simulation CC Starburst. Drag that onto our layer, or you can just drag it right here. Doesn't make any difference. Your properties, we're just going to slow the speed down. It's set it to 1 already by default. We're going to slow it to 0.2. We'll go ahead and hit play, and you have a very simple effect on your background that we're going to add something to that. Now, for your particles, you're going to want them to track something. Otherwise, you're just going to have particles emitting from the dead center of your canvas. And what we're going to do to have them track something is create a new null object. So again, we're going to go to Layer, New, Null Object. And we now have this box in the middle. And the upper left-hand corner is going to be where our particles emit from. And in your null object, you don't really need to change anything, because what we're going to do is we're going to actually grab the pen tool up here, or hit G on your keyboard, and go ahead and click and drag a simple path through our canvas. Now, hopefully what you're doing, you have a specific project in mind, and you'll have something more specific than just a wiggly line. But we have the pen tool, we have a path selected, and on our null object, that says it's a mask, which we don't want. So we're going to go ahead and highlight that and hit Command C on a Mac or Control C on a PC. We're going to go to Transform, go down here to Position. You can also always hit P for Position on your keyboard, and we're going to hit Control V. And we'll do that when we're at the very beginning of our timeline here. And there we go. You notice we have some keyframes added. Looks a little bit more complicated, but we can simplify things out here by going to Masks. Go ahead and delete the mask by hitting Backspace on your keyboard. And now we have that box, the null object, from which our particles will emit, and you can do a lot of other things from this, and it'll travel along this path. This is something similar from a tutorial that Sundoc did. Go ahead and select your keyframes, hold Alt-in, and drag them across so you utilize your entire length of time. Otherwise, you're going to have your particles just sort of sitting there for a bit. Okay, so that's the path my particles will go on. Now go ahead and do a new solid. I'm going to go hit Command Y on a Mac, Control Y on a PC. We'll change this to a slightly different blue just to stay a little bit less confused. And we're going to get rid of that now by going up here to Effects and Presets, and we're going to go ahead and do Particle Systems 2. Now you'll notice a 32, and then a 16. The easier one to use, and it has a few updates, and I'll explain those as far as making your expressions a little simpler. And the 16 is a more complicated version that I'll show you a linear expression to utilize in just a second. Now for the first one, go ahead and drag that 32cc particle systems 2 to your new layer. And you now have a particle emitter right in the middle. Now I'm going to make it a little easier for us to visualize. Again, it doesn't really matter how yours looks. You can make it look however you want. I'm going to change the velocity under the physics to 0.2. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change the particle. We'll go with a star and make it lighter blue, shade of purple, and well, we'll make it look a little bit better than that. Shaded and faded sphere. Okay. And that has a gravity, that's why it's drooping downward at 1. We'll go ahead and set that to 0. So it's going to be very easy to track my particles or see that what I'm doing is working. Now you notice here, if you open up your solid layer, and we'll actually rename this layer by hitting enter, we'll call this particle emitter layer. And we'll rename our null, and we'll call this particle path. Okay, under effects here, CC particle systems, producer, we have a position, and as you can see, we drag that and it moves. I hit Command Z there to make it go back to the middle. So how do we get that to track these keyframes? Very easily, we're just going to grab our pickwhip here, and this is in Adobe After Effects 2020. We're going to go right here from this pickwhip, the curly line. We're going to drag it down to position here. And we are done. That's all you have to do for Adobe After Effects 2020. It is super simple. It's much easier than the previous version. And if you hit pause here, it's going very slow because it is computationally intensive. It'll take a while to render out. If you click down here, you will notice you have a little down arrow because you've created an expression which is just linking your particle path to this position. And expressions in 2020 are very easy because you're able to use the pickwhip for a lot of the things you want. I'm just pointing it to the right positions. Okay, so that's the newer version. Again, that's the 32-bit CC Particle Systems 2, the updated version. For the slightly older version, the 16, it is useful in the sense that it's going to help you understand what expressions do. So watch this. We're going to go ahead and delete our CC Particle Systems 2. And now we're left with the solid blue layer. We're going to go up here and search for effects. We're going to grab the 16cc particle world, the older version, and drop that on our layer, and we have particles. I'm going to go ahead, just for visual reasons, go ahead and change a few items in here. We're going to go with, under physics, we're going to change the velocity to 0.2. Under gravity, we're going to set that to 0. Just going to make it easier to visualize to make sure we're doing things correctly. Because this is where you're going to really be able to test your expression knowledge and be able to really fool around with expressions and see if you understand what's happening here. Because with CC Particle World, if you notice here, and we're under producer, and I can do it either up here or down there, we'll grab up here and we'll just drag left and right. And as it goes to left here, and what we would think about as being 0 on the X scale, 0 pixels, we're going to notice that we have a number of minus 0.5, which doesn't make any sense, right? Why would it be minus 0.5 instead of 0 pixels, and this being 1080 over on our right-hand side? Well, After Effects, in some instances, in some effects, and other apps do this too, they use relative position. And with 0 as our middle, we find ourselves at minus 0.5 and 0.5 being our positions. And then on our y-axis, having, if you will drag it down here, about 0.28 and then 0.28, minus 0.28 for our height. So again, we're not using X and Y's, we're not using 1080 and 1920, and it doesn't make intuitive sense because the way we know about pixels and aspect ratios, it sort of flies out the window for this. So what you're going to go ahead and do is center it back to 0. So now we're here. In fact, you didn't need to change any of that. You can keep the particles looking the way they were. For the way they are now, it's just going to be a little bit easier to visualize to make sure we're doing things correctly. And we'll go ahead and select the bottom area, hit tilde on our keyboard. That's the little tiny line beside the 1. And it's going to expand everything for us. And what we're going to do is we're going to open our null object and open our particle world. We're going to open up producer. And so now we can see position X, position Y. We know our positions down here under null. That is the null object we had earlier along the path. Now this one, with what we have, is we need it to follow that. How do we do that? Especially because we have coordinates that are based on a plane of pixels that we know. And so here at, say, 20 frames in, it's at 144 pixels, 745 on the Y, and we have some understanding we could draw that out. It's like we could graph it. But here, how do we do that with minus 0.5 and 0.28? Well, what we can do is we can go in and click on the stopwatch icon holding Alt, and that will launch our expressions box right here, where we are able to enter our expression language and we can do some programming. And the first thing we're going to enter here is we're going to type linear. Linear is a built-in function. If you're not familiar with programming, you can think of linear as like a built-in program that you can run by just typing linear. And it's going to have parentheses, and the parentheses are for passing arguments or giving that app, that little thing we can run, stuff to pull from and then what to do with it. So position X needs data. Where is it going to get the data from? Well, it's going to get it from our null object down here under position. And the easiest way to do that is grab this little guy called the pickwhip and click and drag it down to position. And now it says linear, our function, our little app. And the first argument or thing that's separated by commas in our function is this comp.layer particle path transform position, which is a fancy way of saying linear function, run this. The first argument is your data source, and your data source is, hey, this comp layer, go down here and go to transform, go to position, and pull these numbers. Now, we only want the X value, and so this is actually what's called an array, which is a container that has two things in it. And in computer science, we call the first container 0. And we're going to go ahead and find that container, the X value, by giving ourselves square brackets and putting a 0 in there. So we're pulling this number right here, which at this point in our timeline is minus 190. We're going to give ourselves a comma, and then we need to supply a scale. And the original scale is what we give it, which our original scale is 0, and then it ends at 1920, which is the number of pixels wide. If you want to be fancy, we can type this comp.width, which goes to our composition, and it finds the width of it, which we know is 1920. But let's exercise our programming and go ahead and type this comp.width, and it will go find it for us. We can utilize that later. Maybe we will be in an instance where we want to copy and paste functions into comps that are different dimensions. And then we need to give it, so it takes the first linear set of a starting point and an ending point, a scale from 0 to 1920, and then we need to have it remap it to new numbers. And our new numbers, as I showed you before, are minus 0.5, the far left of the composition, and 0.5, the far right of the composition. And then we'll give that a semicolon on the end, just because that's proper syntax for JavaScript, which is what After Effects expressions are based on. And what you're going to see is hopefully no little yellow triangle, which will indicate an error. Go ahead, tilde on your keyboard, and let's see if our null object, which is this box here, and our particles track roughly the same x value. And starting, oh, look at that. It's following it. Now it's not going up and down, which is our y value, because we haven't done that yet, but it does appear to be working. Okay, so let's fix our y value. So go ahead and hit tilde again. Go back in here. Alt-click your stopwatch icon, and let's go ahead and copy this. Control-C, or Command-C if you're on a Mac, Command-V, and we're going to need to change a few things. So we're going to still grab our data from down here, but we're going to grab the second item. So let's change the array to 1. And we know it's not the width, so let's go ahead and do height. And now this minus 5 and minus and 0.5. For whatever reason, it deals with the aspect ratios of your composition sometimes. But usually you should do a test to make sure. Because there's actually very little documentation on this. As for HD composition or 16:9 composition, I find that minus 0.28 to be right around the sweet spot. If you do the aspect ratio and you get in the weeds with the numbers, it seems to be about 26, and because if you take 1080 divided by 1920, you get it's around 56% and a quarter of your original number, and so that's probably why we're around 0.28, because that's a little bit over half. That is my theory. I've not been able to find good documentation on it, so you will notice as we come out here, it's tracking. It works. So again, let's take a closer look at this. Again, we have two linear expressions. I should say linear functions. And we're pulling the data from down here. This being the array place 0. And this being array place 1, which is the second number. And we're using our scale of 0 to the width, which we know is 1920, and 0 to the height, which we know is 1080, and then remapping that to a totally new scale, which, as I mentioned, some of the effects in After Effects don't use the way we would intuit it to be, but instead use a scale of, say, minus 0.5 being the far left and 0.5 being the far right, and then minus 0.28 and 0.28 being the height. And so what we're just doing is we're remapping our values from down here. Say 922 is equal to minus 0.02. And you could do the math yourself, and you could try and figure out a complicated algorithm to do that. But why? The linear expression will do it for you. So that will work. Let's go ahead and play the whole animation. And hopefully you found this useful. Hopefully it built up your After Effects expression knowledge. I'm going to link to some other resources down below to help you better understand After Effects expressions. I am by no means an expert. I'm a very marginal programmer and slightly above average at Adobe After Effects, but there is a high learning curve. So there's a lot of people out there who are sort of struggling to figure out After Effects and expressions and all the rest of it. So hopefully this is useful. If you did find it useful, give me a thumbs up and a like, and any questions or comments down below.